dun 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 dun. Beethoven's Ninth, Ode to Joy. That's what it is. Welcome back. Today we're going to start hand building. We are going to go through the process, the steps of actually creating something out of clay, and the foundation of the properties of, wait, that sounded dumb. We are going through the process of actually making something out of clay. And believe it or not, even doing something as simple as a cup with something attached to it, will give you pretty much, dare I say, almost everything you need to know about working with clay. I'm oversimplifying it, of course, because prior to this, we talked about, the amount of water in the clay, what happens to it over time, and what you need to do to make it a finished product. So I digress. It's not just what, this isn't everything, but there's a lot of good information in today's lesson. Okay? So let's get to it. Let's go ahead and start with that bag of clay that you got. Now the other day, or a little bit ago, I took a little chunk of clay out. Right? That little chunk of clay over time will start to dry. Number one thing I want you to do in preparation for future projects is to actually take some of this clay and let it dry out. Okay? The reason for that is because I want you to ultimately have some very, very dry clay. Okay? And this dry clay can be pulverized into a powder. Remember how bad the powder is, but then if you added water to it, it creates what's called slip. Ring, slip. And slip, I'll give a demonstration soon, will be kind of like a glue that holds the piece together. So that we won't use until maybe a day or two after we make our initial piece, okay? But it's something that we need to prepare. Okay? So once again, take some of your pieces, maybe even take it and make little shrapnels like this, because we actually want it to dry out really, really quick. Okay? Don't cover it up, just let it dry out. Even put it out in the sun to let it dry out. It doesn't take long. Okay? So create ultimately some slip. Now you don't need a fancy container like this either. You can, of course, use a plastic bag. You can even use a cup. Okay? But set that aside, let that dry out. Ultimately, it will become a powder like this. Okay? And then we'll talk about what to do with it in a little bit. Okay? So the clay itself, we talked about how clay is bound together by like little platelets with water. Right? The problem with clay is through the firing process, what happens is that if there is any trapped air inside the body of the clay, that air makes a pocket. And what happens to moisture when it finds a pocket and it's superheated? It expands. It becomes a gas, and pop, it blows apart. Okay? So the clay I gave you is fresh from the manufacturer. Okay? There should not be air bubbles inside the clay. Right? And so I'm going to try to simplify this by not talking too much about wedging, because wedging is a process of basically massaging all the air out of the clay. Now, if you're using recycled clay, which you are not, then you would need to do this just to ensure that there's no air trapped in the clay. Okay? In this particular case, because we don't want to run the risk of putting the clay back together and trapping air into it, I'm going to ask you to cut just enough of your clay out to make a little cup. Okay? How much does that take? Depends. So here's what I'm going to suggest. Okay? This is some wire that I used from our wire project. Okay? And that cuts the clay pretty well. Okay? You can kind of use that as a little saw. Go down about, I don't know, what is that, an inch? And then cut out a little notch. Okay. Look at that. Okay. So when you look into it, and I'm going to show this camera, when you look into it, you should not see any like little trapped air, little air bubbles, because that would be bad. So this is fresh clay. It's really nice. Put that aside. That's about how much we're going to use, maybe even less. Okay. It doesn't really matter because right now we're just going over the basics. Okay. What should I do with this? Wrap it up nice and tight. Put it aside because I don't want that to dry out. Right. So now I have this nice fresh piece of plastic clay, okay? But it is not in the form that I want it to be. Okay, so I'm going to actually, I'm going to make a pretty small cup. So I'm going to actually, believe it or not, I'm going to take that apart in two pieces. It's about the size of the palm of my hand. Does it have to be the size of the palm of your hand? No, that just is what it is. This one's a little bit bigger. Okay. So, number one, we want clay with no trapped air in it. Okay. Now, if I start pulling this apart and reassembling it and mashing it together, I run the risk of trapping air. Okay. So that process of wedging normally is to basically massage the clay to get the air out. Here's another alternative: making a ball, because we want our little cup to be symmetrical. Okay. So how do you do that? You got this ugly piece of clay, and here's what I do. I start patting it. Start patting it. Slapping it. Right? And I'm doing two things here. One is I'm making it symmetrical. I'm making it even. Okay, I could even be making a little disc. It doesn't have to be a ball per se. Okay? But I'm also pounding out air. So one of the things that ceramicists are known for doing is pottery. And this is actually a step in throwing as well on a potter's wheel. So ultimately, you should have something that's somewhat symmetrical. Here's an original piece. Here's the one that I kind of pounded into a ball / disc. Okay. You see? Put that one away. I'm going to actually put that, pretend that's being covered in plastic. Okay? So I now have a piece that I can work with. No trapped air, making a ball, sort of disc thing. Okay? Now I'm going to actually do the process of making the cup itself. Okay? And it's actually very similar to if you learn to throw. So these skills can be transferable. Okay? My goal is ultimately to make a cup or a little bowl. Right? This is going to teach us a few things. One, it's going to teach us kind of the properties of the clay, how it reacts to being handled, and how fast it can dry out. The second thing it does is it will teach us about thickness of clay and how to gauge the thickness and how to work with it. Okay? So, simply put, in the center, I can press down with my thumb. Now I don't want to press all the way down because it'll just kind of crack and start to break the clay up. I want to gently massage the clay into the form I want. And in this particular case, I am going to be making a symmetrical cup, or as symmetrical as I can. So here's why it's called a pinch pot. Because you're pinching. You can use 2 fingers, 3 fingers. I like to use my thumb on the inside and the rest of my fingers on the outside. And I'm pinching, and I don't know if you can tell, but I'm turning the piece of clay as well. Now, I am giving equal resistance between my thumb and my fingers. Okay? What that's actually doing is it's compacting the clay even more. It's also keeping the sides of the walls going up versus out. So don't pull out. No, up, pinch up. See that? And then you can feel, like, you know, I'll change with my fingers. And the concept here is to ultimately get a evenly bodied, a uniform thickness of about a thumb. It's called the rule of thumb. Now the great part about this is it becomes very, how should you say, tactile. And what I mean by that is you can actually make one of these with your eyes closed because it becomes about the feeling. You can actually feel how thick it is, right? You can feel the bottom, you can gauge the thickness, you can kind of feel around it, right? And if you find that your sides are kind of bowing out, then give a little resistance on the outside. Now on the inside here, I am getting kind of this bowl look, and it is thick around the edges. So I might pinch a little bit harder or push out towards the bottom there to make it more of a cylinder. Okay? Now if you start to develop little cracks, okay, don't worry too much about it. It might mean you need to slow down a bit. It might mean that you need to try to compact the clay a little bit more. You might be able to even take some of the clay at the bottom, which is a little wetter, and basically rub it and smear it into some of those smaller cracks. So the reason why we start out so simple is because, again, this is a training exercise to understand proper thickness of clay. Because if it's really thick and you put it in that kiln and you fire it, air cannot get out. Water cannot get out, so it will basically break apart and explode. So that's why I'm squeezing it. Now people always ask, how thick should I make it? We call it the rule of thumb because it's about the thickness of a thumb. Now of course some people's thumbs are a lot thinner, some are thicker. So let's just call this 1/4 inch. Can it be thinner? Absolutely. Okay? But after a while, you know, you should start to get a little bit of a, you know, you should get a cup, right? And if you want a flat bottom, you can kind of tap it. Because here's another lesson about clay, is at this stage, it is very plastic. Remember, plastic means you can still bend it. Now if you're starting to get these little cracks, there's that little cup of water. You can do this. Now, I shouldn't push this idea too much because only a little bit of water is necessary to smooth out a crack. The problem is people will douse it with water and it becomes a big mess. If you want to learn, then do that, but you will be sorry. You don't need a lot of water. You just need a little bit to basically create that slip to smooth out the surface. The other thing that people like to do with a clay piece is smooth it out until it has all these finger marks on it. Something like this, something simple, you can do that, that's fine. But the idea is to understand clay thickness, start to feel how it, even after this little bit of time, starts to dry out just a bit and starts to get those micro cracks, okay? But there's a certain point where we want to stop, okay? I'm gonna stop this when I feel like it is perfectly, has a perfect thickness, okay? It sits nicely and it's pretty smooth. Now, I have a saying, don't fall in love. Do not fall in love. I'm not saying, find the person of your dreams and, settle down and stuff, but the problem with art is that it's kind of an organic experience and that it should develop and grow and change and things can happen, and I don't want you to grow too attached to anything. And I also want you to have that growth mindset so that if something does happen, you can deal with the problem. Okay? So at this point, I'm going to leave this alone. That's not bad. I can feel around it. I can feel the thickness. So what I was doing, I pressed my thumb in the center. I pinched around while turning. I was giving equal resistance. I was trying to achieve a uniform thickness. Rule of thumb, it can be thinner. Right? And if you're getting little micro cracks, you can clean it up with water. Okay? So this is basically the principle of clay. You can learn a lot from just making this little cup. Okay? Clay thickness, wetness, clay body. Okay? So what I want you to do with this little practice piece is to cover it up. Wrap it up in plastic pretty well. I don't want it to dry out because the next lesson will be about attaching clay to clay. And it's a really important one because after you understand how to attach clay onto clay, you can do just about anything you want with it. Knowing and understanding some basic principles and a little bit of practice, you'll be able to do whatever you want. Okay? So keep this covered, get some plastic, keep it covered, and we'll come back to it very soon.